Don't bother bringing dinner up. He can manage it himself for once. Vivian Hollister's voice carried through the upstairs corridor. It was the sharp, polished voice she used when she wanted to be overheard. The young housemaid froze halfway up the back stairs. The silver tray trembled in her hands. From the open doorway of the master suite, the words traveled into the room with surgical precision. Marcus Hollister sat propped against 3 pillows. A cloth napkin was tucked beneath his collar like a child waiting to be fed. He had heard her. She had meant for him to hear her. His right hand rested on the embroidered blanket. The tremor moved through his fingers in a slow, relentless rhythm. It had carried that rhythm for nearly 2 years now. Parkinson's, the specialists called it. The name had never quite captured what it actually did to a man. The disease had not destroyed him all at once. It had taken him gradually, week by week, in small humiliations. A pen that slipped from his grip, a teacup that refused to stay level, a spoon that arrived at his mouth empty more often than full. Tonight, the spoon lay on the side table beside an untouched bowl of vegetable soup. It had been sitting there for nearly an hour. Vivian appeared in the doorway. The warm amber light from the hallway framed her cream silk blouse and tailored navy trousers. Her platinum bob was pinned neatly behind one ear. In her left hand, she held a leather folio thick with medical reports. In her right, she carried a glass of red wine she had no intention of finishing in this room. "Vivian," Marcus said. His voice came out lower than he had meant it to. "Please, just sit with me for a few minutes." She did not move from the doorway. "I have sat with you, Marcus. I have sat through 3 consultations this month. I have sat through every dinner that ended on the carpet instead of in your stomach. I have sat through enough." "It's one evening. It is every evening." He closed his eyes briefly. There had been a time when Vivian's voice was the first sound he wanted to hear in the morning. He could not pinpoint exactly when that had stopped being true. He only knew that somewhere between the second neurologist and the third missed anniversary, she had stopped speaking to him. She had started speaking around him. The way people speak around furniture they are preparing to replace. "I'm not asking for much," he said. She tilted her head. The lamplight caught the edge of her wineglass. "You're asking for everything, Marcus. You just don't see it that way. You're the one drowning. You don't notice what it costs the people standing on the shore." The cruelty was so casual it did not sound like cruelty at all. That was what hurt the most. Her unkindness had become indistinguishable from her composure. It arrived in the same measured tone she used to compliment the florist's arrangements. Marcus reached for the spoon. His fingers closed around it on the second try. The tremor was bad tonight, worse than it had been all week. He lowered the spoon into the soup and lifted carefully. Lift, hold, bring it to the mouth. A child could do it. A healthy man would not even notice he was doing it. He made it halfway before the surge came. The spoon struck the rim of the bowl. Tomato broth splashed across the front of his pale blue pajama shirt. It splashed onto the leather folio Vivian had set on the corner of the bed. A bright orange streak spread across the topmost page. It blurred the latest specialist's notes into something that looked like a wound. For a moment, no one moved. "I didn't mean to," Marcus said. The apology came out automatically. It had come out every night for the past 6 months. He had begun apologizing for his own body the way other men apologized for arriving late to dinner. Vivian set down her wineglass on the dresser. She crossed the room in 3 sharp strides. She picked up the folio, shook the worst of the broth onto the blanket, and held the stained pages out toward him like an indictment. "Do you know what these say, Marcus?" He did not answer. "They say it is not getting better. They say it has never been getting better. Every report is the same report. Every specialist tells me the same thing in a slightly different voice. And meanwhile, I am supposed to keep arranging dinners around a man who can no longer feed himself." She threw the folio onto the foot of the bed. The papers fanned outward. They settled across his legs in a quiet, damp accusation. Marcus looked down at his own name printed at the top of one sheet. The letters were smeared now, beyond easy reading. For the first time in many months, he felt the precise weight of being seen as a problem. Not a person. A problem. Out in the corridor, on the narrow bench reserved for staff children whose mothers had been called to clean late, A small girl in a mustard yellow sweater sat very still. Her sneakered feet no longer swung. She had heard every word. Her name was Imani Ross. She was 8 years old. She had come to the Hollister estate 3 afternoons a week for almost a year. Her mother Denise had been hired to supervise the upper floor cleaning. Most days, Imani sat in the small staff lounge near the kitchen. She read library books with covers softened from too many borrowings. She traced patterns into the steam on the back windows when the dishwashers ran. She had been told never to climb the back stairs. She had been told never to enter the family corridors. She had been told that the people upstairs lived a different life than the people downstairs. A good child kept to the side of the house where she had been placed. Tonight, she had drifted farther than usual. Denise had been called up to the linen room on the second floor. A late delivery had arrived. She had set Imani on the bench in the back hallway with a careful kiss to the top of her head. She had told her to stay put. For 20 minutes Imani had stayed. Then voices had begun moving above her, sharp ones, raised ones. Her 8-year-old body had done what 8-year-old bodies sometimes do without consulting their owners. She had stood, she had walked, she had climbed. Now she sat on the narrow bench in the upper service corridor. Her hands were folded in her lap. She was listening to a marriage end one slow sentence at a time. She did not understand all the words. Specialists, reports, folios. These were grown-up sounds, the kind adults used when they did not want children to follow them. But she understood the shape of what was happening. A man was sick. A woman was angry. A spoon had spilled. Somewhere in the bright cruelty of the woman's voice was a sound Imani recognized from her own life. It was the sound her aunt had used on her uncle the year before he moved out. The sound that meant a person had already left in their heart even if their feet were still in the room. Inside the bedroom, Vivian was finishing. "From now on," she said, clipping each word neatly in half, "if he insists on handling it himself, let him. I am done cleaning up after this." She turned without waiting for an answer. She walked to the doorway, then paused, then called sharply down the corridor. "Mrs. Albright, bring 2 of the girls. The tray needs to go." Mrs. Albright appeared within a minute. 2 younger maids stood behind her. All 3 of them had the downcast eyes of staff who had walked into too many of these scenes already. They did not look at Marcus directly. Staff in houses like this learned early that the kindest thing they could offer a humiliated man was the courtesy of not witnessing him too closely. "Yes, Mrs. Hollister," Mrs. Albright said. Vivian adjusted the cuff of her sleeve. She picked up her wineglass from the dresser. She walked out without looking back. The maids moved with quiet efficiency. The younger one lifted the tray. The other gathered the damp medical papers, one by one. She folded the stained ones inward so the worst of the mess disappeared from sight. Mrs. Albright stepped closer to Marcus. Her expression was carefully composed. She had spent 30 years remaining professional in rooms where dignity was bleeding out by the minute. "Sir," she said softly, "let me help you change your shirt." "No," the word came out raw. "Leave it." She nodded once. Within 3 minutes they were gone. The bedroom returned to a silence so complete that Marcus could hear the faint ticking of the antique clock on the mantel. In the corridor, the maids passed Imani without noticing her at first. They were murmuring to each other in low, half-private voices, the kind staff used when they believed themselves alone. "She really meant it this time," one whispered. "Did you see his shirt? He barely got a swallow in." "It's getting worse. Dr. Lehman said his tremors are doubled from 6 months ago. And Mrs. Hollister is just done. You can tell she's done." "Well, wouldn't you be?" The older maid stopped on that last sentence. She had finally noticed the small figure on the bench. For a moment her face shifted through several expressions: embarrassment, kindness. The blank look of a woman who knew that a child overhearing the wrong thing could become a problem for everyone. She offered Imani a tight smile. "You waiting for your mama, honey?" Imani nodded. "She'll be down soon." The maids continued past her toward the back stairs. Their footsteps faded into the kitchen level. The tray went with them. The folio went with them. The evidence of the evening was being removed rather than addressed, but the words had already landed in Imani. A man could not eat his dinner. A woman had walked away. Nobody, not the maids, not the manager, not the wife, was going back into that room. She sat very still for almost a full minute. Then she slid down from the bench. She set her small hand against the polished banister to steady herself. She walked, very softly, toward the bedroom door that had been left half open at the end of the hall. The hallway carpet swallowed the sound of her sneakers. Imani moved the way children move in churches and hospitals, careful and small, as though noise itself might be a kind of trespass. At the end of the corridor, the bedroom door stood ajar by perhaps 6 inches. The warm amber light from inside spilled into the hallway in a narrow gold stripe across the dark wood floor. She paused on the edge of that stripe. One small hand rested against the door frame. She could see him from here, just a sliver of him, the pale blue of his stained pajama shirt, the corner of the 4-poster bed, one trembling hand resting on the embroidered blanket. He had not moved since the maids left. He sat exactly as they had left him, like a man who had been arranged on a shelf and forgotten there. For a moment, Imani thought about turning around. Her mother's voice was in her head, very clear. It told her to go back to the bench. It told her that good children did not climb stairs they had not been invited to climb. But beneath her mother's voice there was another sound now. The sound of the man inside, breathing slowly and unevenly. The way people breathe when they are trying very hard not to cry. She stepped through the doorway. Marcus turned his head at the small movement. His eyes, tired and red-rimmed, took a moment to focus on what he was seeing. When they did, his expression shifted through 3 or 4 different reactions in the space of a single breath. Surprise, confusion, a flicker of something almost like alarm, and then gradually a softening that he did not seem entirely able to control. "What are you doing in here?" His voice was not unkind. It was simply worn out. The voice of a man who had been startled at the end of a very long day. Imani took another small step into the room. She stopped near the corner of the bed. Her hands were clasped in front of her yellow sweater. "I heard them," she said. Marcus blinked slowly. "Heard who?" "The ladies, on the stairs. They were talking about your dinner." He looked away from her, toward the dark window where the night had already settled over the back lawn. When he spoke again, his voice was lower. "You shouldn't listen to people gossip." They weren't whispering very good. Something almost moved at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, the kind of expression a person makes when a child has unexpectedly said something more honest than the room deserves. It vanished before it could fully form. Imani watched him for a few more seconds. Then she did something she would not be able to explain later, not to her mother, not to Mrs. Albright, not even to herself. She walked closer. Crossed the thick rug in 5 quiet steps. She stopped beside the edge of the 4-poster bed. "Are you sad?" she asked. The question landed somewhere in him that he had thought was already closed. Marcus drew in a slow breath. He looked at her properly for the first time. She had large brown eyes, the kind that seemed to take in too much for a face that's small. She was waiting for an answer the way only children wait, without impatience, without performance. The way a person waits when they genuinely want to know. "Yes," he said quietly, "I am. Because of your hands." He glanced down at the right one, still trembling steadily against the blanket. "Because of a lot of things." She nodded as though this were a sensible answer. Most adults in his life had spent the last 2 years pretending his hands did not shake. They had pretended his condition was a temporary inconvenience that could be polished over with the right schedule. This child looked at his trembling fingers the way she might have looked at rain on a window, something that was simply happening, something that did not require either apology or denial. "They said you didn't eat," she said. "They say a lot of things." "Is it true?" He almost lied. The habit of self-preservation was strong in him even now, but there was something about the way she was looking at him, the small seriousness of her, the absence of any judgment in her question. The lie felt ridiculous before he had finished forming it. "Yes," he said, "it's true." Imani turned her head and looked around the room. Her eyes moved across the disordered bed, the cream-colored walls, the antique clock on the mantel, the tall windows where the curtains had been pulled half open. Finally, her gaze settled on the small side table near the armchair by the window. Someone had left a covered silver dish behind. Perhaps Mrs. Albright. Perhaps one of the maids in the rush of the tray removal. "There's still food," she said. Marcus followed her gaze. He had not noticed the dish. He had assumed they had taken everything when they took the rest. "Imani," he said. Then he stopped, surprised at himself. He had not realized he knew her name. He must have heard it once in passing, perhaps from Mrs. Albright, perhaps from Denise herself in the hallway one morning. The name had filed itself away somewhere quiet. "You don't have to do that." She was already walking toward the table. She lifted the silver cover with both hands, the way she might have lifted the lid of something delicate at her grandmother's house. Underneath sat a small dish of apple compote, a few soft pieces of buttered toast cut into triangles, a folded linen napkin tucked beside the spoon as an afterthought. It was not a meal so much as the soft, forgotten remains of one. The kind of food kitchens prepared for invalids when no one was sure what else to send up. Imani picked up the dish carefully in both hands. She brought the napkin and the spoon along with it. She walked back across the rug to the side of the bed. "You don't have to," Marcus said again. The words came out weaker this time. His own body was already arguing against the protest. He had not eaten since the morning. His hands trembled from hunger as much as from anything else now. Imani considered the height of the bed for a moment. Then she climbed onto the small, upholstered bench beside it. Her shoulders came almost level with his. She set the dish carefully on the blanket near his knee. She unfolded the napkin across her lap with the seriousness of a child who had been taught to do things properly. She picked up the spoon. "It's just applesauce," she said. "Applesauce is easy." She scooped a small portion onto the spoon, no more than a single careful bite. She held it up toward him. For a moment, Marcus simply looked at it. He could feel the heat of embarrassment rising in his face. The old, familiar humiliation. He was a grown man. He had built 3 companies. He had testified before Senate committees. He had been on the cover of business magazines whose names this child would never have reason to recognize. And he was about to be fed applesauce by an 8-year-old who weighed less than the suit jackets he had once worn to negotiate billion-dollar mergers. But Imani was waiting. The spoon held steady in her small fingers, her face neither pitying nor uncomfortable. She was simply offering, and there was something in the offer that bypassed his pride entirely and went straight to a place inside him that had been hungry for far longer than his stomach had. He opened his mouth. The applesauce was cool. It was sweet. It was, in every measurable way, an absurdly small bite of food, but it was the first thing he had swallowed since lunch. It hit him with an ache he had not been prepared for. Imani waited for him to finish. Then she dipped the spoon again and offered another. He took it. She offered a third. He took that one too. Between bites, she watched his trembling hand with open concern, not disgust, not pity, the simple attention of a child trying to understand something new. When a small bit of applesauce slipped from the corner of his mouth on the 4th bite, she immediately reached for the napkin. She leaned in. She dabbed it away with the same gentle motion her own mother used on her at dinner time. "Sorry," Marcus muttered automatically. Imani shook her head. "You don't have to say sorry for that." He looked at her, startled. Adults had been saying sorry to him for months in the way that meant inconvenience. The staff said sorry for small mistakes. He himself had been saying sorry for needing too much, for being too difficult to watch, for existing in the room in the particular way illness had made him exist. Somewhere along the line, he had begun apologizing simply for being a person who was hard to witness. And here was this child treating spilled applesauce like spilled rain, like a thing that needed wiping up, like a thing that carried no shame at all. She offered him another spoonful. This time his hand jerked suddenly without warning. A soft lump of applesauce dropped onto the blanket near his knee. "Oh," Imani said, but the sound was small and matter-of-fact. Marcus's face tightened at once. "There, you see." But she only set the dish back down. She picked up the napkin again. She cleaned the blanket with small, patient dabs. "It's okay," she said. "My mama says eating messy is still eating." The sentence pulled something strange out of him, a half-breath, half-broken sound that startled them both. It took Marcus a full second to recognize it as a laugh. He had not laughed in his own room in so long that the sound felt foreign in his own chest. Imani brightened at once, the way children do when they have made a sad adult smile. "That sounds better than being sad," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was rougher than he had intended. "You really shouldn't be this kind to strangers, Imani." She tilted her head slightly. "Why? Because most strangers don't deserve it." She thought about that with the same serious expression she had used for everything else that evening. Then she shrugged one small shoulder beneath the yellow sweater. She dipped the spoon into the applesauce again. She lifted it toward him. "You're not a stranger," she said. "You're hungry." The simplicity of it nearly undid him. Marcus opened his mouth. He took the bite. For the first time in many months, he allowed himself to be fed by another human being without the heavy weight of shame following the food down. The room around them softened. The clock on the mantel kept its quiet rhythm. The tremor in his right hand continued, as it always would, but it no longer felt like the loudest thing in the room. Then, distant but unmistakable, the sound of high heels began moving down the upstairs corridor. Imani heard them before Marcus did. She turned slightly on the bench, the spoon still raised in her small hand. Her body went very still in the particular way children's bodies go still when they have realized too late that they have done something they should not have done. The footsteps grew louder. They paused once near the top of the staircase. Then they resumed with sharper purpose. The bedroom door swung wider without warning. Vivian Hollister stood on the threshold, one hand still on the brass knob. Her cream silk blouse caught the lamplight in soft folds. Her gaze took in the room in 3 quick movements. First Marcus, propped against the pillows with a faint orange smudge of applesauce at the corner of his mouth. Then the dish on the blanket, the napkin draped across a child's lap, the spoon raised mid-bite. Then Imani herself, perched on the upholstered bench like a small yellow bird that had flown through an open window by mistake. For one long second, no one in the room spoke. "What?" Vivian said at last, in the soft, careful voice she used when she was at her most dangerous. "Exactly as this." It was not a question. It was the opening sentence of an interrogation that did not yet know its full shape. Imani lowered the spoon slowly. Her face did not show fear, not yet, because she had not yet learned to recognize all the warning signs of adult cruelty when they arrived without raised voices. She simply turned on the bench to look at the woman in the doorway. She answered the way an 8-year-old answers when she believes she has done a simple, helpful thing. "He was hungry," she said. Vivian's eyes moved down to the child as though she were noticing only now that compassion could look this small. "And who told you that you were allowed in here?" Imani glanced once at Marcus, then back at Vivian. "Nobody." "No," Vivian said quietly. "I imagine not." Marcus felt the air in the room change. A few minutes earlier, he had been too worn down to resist kindness. He had eaten applesauce from the hands of a child whose presence was the single mercy of his evening. Now the shame returned with full force, sharp and immediate, but it was no longer only shame for himself. It was shame that this small girl who had walked toward him when everyone else had stepped away should now have to stand inside his wife's contempt. "She was helping me," he said. Vivian looked at him as though he had said something faintly absurd. "Helping you?" "Yes." Her laugh came thin and brittle, the same laugh he had heard her use at dinner parties on people she considered beneath her attention. "So this is where we are now, Marcus. A child from the cleaning staff is feeding you in our bedroom." Imani lowered the spoon further. She did not set it down. There was a small, stubborn dignity in her refusal to look away. The hurried sound of softer footsteps came from the corridor before Vivian could continue. A moment later, Denise Ross appeared in the doorway behind her, breathless. One hand pressed against her chest, her eyes found Imani first, then the bed, then Vivian, the color drained from her face so quickly it looked almost painful. "Oh, Lord," Denise whispered. "Imani." Her daughter turned with no trace of guilt, only mild surprise. "Mama, he was hungry." Denise crossed the room so fast she nearly stumbled on the corner of the rug. "I told you to stay downstairs. I told you not to wander." Her voice shook in a way Imani had almost never heard before, not because Denise was angry, because Denise was afraid. "I told you, baby. I told you 100 times." "I know, but they said it doesn't matter what they said." Vivian stepped aside from the doorway and folded her arms across her chest. "Apparently your daughter has made herself very comfortable in private rooms." Denise straightened. Her hands were trembling now, though for an entirely different reason than Marcus's hands trembled. "Mrs. Hollister, I am so sorry. I don't know how she got up here. I only turned my back for a minute. The delivery in the linen room took longer than I thought it would." "She walked," Vivian said quite confidently. "That much I can see." Denise reached for Imani's shoulder. She drew her gently off the bench. The applesauce dish remained behind on the blanket. The spoon still rested inside it. "It won't happen again, Mrs. Hollister, I promise you. I will speak to her tonight. I will speak to her every night this week if I have to." Vivian's eyes narrowed slightly. "No, it will not happen again." Marcus heard what lay inside those 4 words. So did Denise. In a house like this, dismissal never needed to be spoken directly. It often arrived disguised as tone, as timing, as the sentence that came just before the actual sentence. "Vivian," Marcus said quietly. She did not look at him. "I think we have been more than generous with boundaries in this house, Marcus." "Vivian." This time he said her name with more weight. She turned. There was open irritation on her face. He drew in a careful breath. His right hand twitched once against the blanket. "Do not take this out on them." Denise lowered her eyes at once. Imani looked between the 3 adults. She was trying to understand why feeding someone applesauce could make the room feel this cold. Vivian stared at Marcus in disbelief. "You are defending this?" "Yes. She disobeyed every house rule we have. Her mother lost track of her. And I walk into our bedroom to find a staff member's child playing nursemaid to my husband as though this were a charity ward." "No," Marcus said. His voice was firmer now than it had been all evening. "You walked in and found the only person in this house tonight who made sure I didn't go to bed hungry." The sentence stopped the room. Denise looked up despite herself. Imani went very still. Vivian's expression did not soften. It sharpened instead, in the particular way it sharpened when she had been wounded somewhere her composure was not yet ready to acknowledge. "That," she said, "is not a child's responsibility." "It shouldn't have been," Marcus replied, "but it became one." For a brief moment, neither of them moved. Marcus could feel the old balance of their marriage shifting somewhere beneath the words. The long, slow arrangement they had perfected over the past 2 years was rearranging itself by inches. Denise cleared her throat softly. "Mr. Hollister, I truly am sorry. Imani didn't mean any harm." "I know she didn't." Vivian's head turned at once. "Take your daughter downstairs, please, right now." "Yes, ma'am." Imani turned on the bench and looked up at Marcus. The applesauce dish was still on the blanket near his knee. The napkin she had been holding in her lap had fallen, half-folded, onto the side of the mattress. She looked at it for a moment. Then, with the small, careful seriousness she brought to all important matters, she leaned forward and tucked it gently within his reach. "I can come back later," she said softly. Denise's eyes widened in alarm. Vivian let out a humorless breath. "No. You cannot." Imani looked confused. "Why?" "Because this is not your place." The words hung there, larger than the room, larger than the child they were meant for. Marcus saw the faint change in Imani's face. The way children's faces change when they realize an adult has just drawn a line around them. Before Denise could pull her toward the door, Marcus spoke again. "She was kind to me." Vivian did not bother hiding her impatience. "Kindness does not erase impropriety, Marcus. Neither does wealth erase cruelty." The words were out before he had decided to say them. For one stunned second, even Denise forgot to breathe. Vivian's face lost all expression. Marcus knew, because he had known her long enough to know, that this was when she looked most dangerous. She did not respond with another sentence. She did not need to. She simply turned toward the door with the rigid control of a woman who had been challenged in front of staff and would not soon forget the audience. "Take the child out," she said. "Now." Denise guided Imani toward the hallway, one protective hand between the girl's shoulder blades. At the threshold, Imani twisted around just enough to look back across the room. The lamplight caught the soft yellow of her sweater one last time. "Good night, Mr. Hollister." The room seemed to hold itself still, waiting. "Good night, Imani." Denise led her out. Their footsteps softened down the corridor and disappeared toward the back stairs. Vivian remained in the doorway for another moment. Then, without another word, she left too. The bedroom door did not slam. It closed with the soft, controlled click of someone who had already decided how she would describe this evening to herself later. The silence that followed was not the same as the silence Marcus had known before Imani entered. The old silence had felt defeated. This one felt altered. On the blanket beside him, the small dish of applesauce still sat with the spoon resting at an angle inside it. He looked at the last pale streaks clinging to the edges of the dish. He felt the strangest mix of emotions rising in him at once: embarrassment, gratitude, grief, and something dangerously close to relief. Someone had seen him tonight. Someone had not turned away. Downstairs, Denise did not speak until they reached the service corridor. Her hand on Imani's shoulder was firmer than usual, the kind of grip that told a child trouble had arrived wearing grown-up shoes. They reached the narrow bench where Imani had been told to wait in the first place. Denise knelt in front of her daughter and took both of the girl's small hands into her own. "What were you thinking, baby?" Imani looked at her mother's face and saw fear there before anger. That made the answer feel more important than usual. "He was hungry, Mama." Denise closed her eyes briefly as though the simplicity of it hurt. "I know what you thought. I know you meant to help, but you cannot just walk into people's private rooms in a house like this. Do you understand me? Not upstairs, not ever." "Why?" The question landed harder than it should have. Denise had been bracing herself for it the entire descent down the stairs. "Because there are rules," she thought. "Because some people get forgiven for breaking them and some people get fired. Because kindness means one thing when it comes from a woman in pearls. It means something very different when it comes from a small black girl whose mother cleans up after dinner. But children deserve truths they could carry, not burdens too heavy for their age." "Because this is where I work," Denise said finally. "And work is how we pay the rent, and how we keep the lights on, and how we keep food in the apartment. If Mrs. Hollister thinks I can't follow the rules of her house, she can send me home and tell me not to come back." Imani's face changed at once. "Because of me?" "No, not because of you being bad, but still because of me." Denise touched her daughter's cheek. The hardest part of raising a careful child in a careless world was the moment they began to understand that goodness and safety were not always the same thing. "He said everybody leaves," Imani whispered. Denise went very still. She had not meant to ask any more questions. In truth, she had not wanted to know what had passed between her daughter and Marcus Hollister in that room. The less a woman in her position knew, the safer she usually was. But there had been something in Marcus's voice upstairs when he defended Imani, something stripped raw enough to cut through all the polish of the house. "He said that to you, baby," Imani nodded. "He said when people get sick long enough, everybody turns their back on them." Denise sat back on her heels and looked down the corridor toward the kitchen. A server passed through carrying folded napkins and did not so much as glance their way. In this house, private suffering traveled by rumor long before it ever arrived as compassion. She had seen enough over the past months to know that Marcus had not been exaggerating. The man had not become gentle under illness. Power did not evaporate that neatly. He could still be curt on the wrong day, still proud on the wrong morning. Still impossible to please when his hands betrayed him in front of guests, but that was not the same as deserving abandonment. Too many people in large houses learn to confuse inconvenience with character. She rose to her feet and smoothed the front of her apron with both hands. "Listen to me, Imani. You were trying to be good, I know that, but you have to stay close to me the rest of the night, right here on this bench, all right?" "Yes, Mama." "Can I see him tomorrow?" The answer came too fast. Sharpened by fear. "No." Imani's mouth fell open. Denise softened immediately, but not enough to take it back. "For now, no. We are going to keep our heads down and finish our work and go home, and we are going to thank the good Lord that we still have a job in the morning. Do you understand me?" Imani leaned back against the wall behind the bench. The kitchen lights down the corridor cast a warm rectangle of brightness across the polished stone floor. "He didn't look mean, Mama." Denise almost smiled despite herself. "I didn't say he was mean. He looked lonely." That word landed closer to the truth than most adults in this house would have dared speak out loud. They stayed another hour. Denise polished the last sideboard in the breakfast room. She straightened the mudroom shelves. She signed off on a supply checklist Mrs. Albright had left near the kitchen sink. Imani sat with a coloring book and a short pencil from her mother's purse, unusually quiet, filling in the petals of a flower with careful pink strokes. Every now and then, she looked toward the back stairs as though listening for something. By the time they stepped onto the rear driveway, the October air had turned crisp enough to sting their cheeks. Their old sedan waited under a spill of yellow security light, its paint dulled by years and weather. Imani climbed into the back seat without being told. Denise slid behind the wheel and sat for a moment with both hands resting on it, the engine still off. The Hollister estate rose behind them in perfect stillness, all stone and symmetry and quiet money, the kind of place that looked from a distance like the kind of home that kept its pain hidden out of principle. She turned the key. The engine coughed, it shuddered, then it caught on the second try. "Mama," Imani said from the back seat as they pulled away from the servant's entrance. "Yes, baby." Why was Mrs. Hollister so mad? Denise kept her eyes on the road. The private drive curved beneath bare branch trees. The property faded slowly in her rearview mirror. Some people don't like being reminded of what they should have done themselves. Imani thought about that, but I just fed him. I know. The roads changed from private curves to quieter town streets. Modest storefronts gone dark for the night. Traffic lights blinking yellow at empty intersections. Imani's voice came again, sleepier now. "Do you think he ate the rest after we left?" Denise tightened her hands on the wheel. She thought of Marcus's face when Imani had said good night. The way his voice had changed around the child's name. She thought of the small dish nearly empty on the blanket, of a man too young to sound that defeated, of the precise small tremor in his hand that had not stopped through the entire conversation. "I hope so," she said. But even as she spoke, she knew hope was a thin thing in a house where dinner could be canceled with a sentence. Upstairs in the master bedroom, Marcus Hollister had not gone to sleep. He had taken his evening medication with difficulty. He had changed into a clean shirt with no assistance. The small dish Imani had brought him was gone now, collected at some point by a quiet hand that had not knocked. But the napkin she had folded and tucked within his reach still lay on the bedside table beside the lamp. He had not asked for it to remain there. He had not touched it either, yet he kept looking at it, as if the plain square of cloth had become proof that the evening had actually happened the way he remembered it, that a child had walked into the ruins of his pride and behaved as though nothing about him was too broken to deserve care. Down the corridor, he heard the distant opening and closing of Vivian's dressing room drawers. He did not call for her. He did not expect her. He understood now, more clearly than he had understood anything in months, that the silence between their rooms had stopped being accidental a long time ago. And somewhere far beneath the weight of illness, of humiliation, of the cold machinery his marriage had become, Marcus Hollister felt something fragile and unfamiliar beginning to return. Not strength, not yet, but the memory of warmth. If this story is touching your heart, please take a moment to like this video. Leave a comment telling us where you are watching from. Subscribe to the channel for more stories that remind us kindness still matters. By the next afternoon, the Hollister estate looked exactly as it always had from the outside. The gray stone facade stood clean against a pale autumn sky. The hedges trimmed with military precision. The fountain in the circular drive spilling water in a steady, polished stream, indifferent to weather, illness, or marriage. To anyone passing beyond the iron gates, it was still the home of a man who had everything. To the people inside, it had become a house where every silence carried meaning, and every small adjustment in routine was being read by someone. Denise Ross arrived 10 minutes early. She did that whenever she was nervous. She had spent half the night replaying the previous evening in her head. She had been trying to predict whether Mrs. Albright would meet her at the service door with a clipboard and a final paycheck. Instead, Mrs. Albright met her with a clipboard and a short professional nod. The sitter had canceled again. Imani had come along in her navy coat and yellow sweater, her hair freshly braided. She walked beside her mother into the laundry room with the bright, careful quiet of a child who already knew the rules of the day before they had been spoken. "You stay here," Denise told her, kneeling to unbutton the coat. "Unless I come for you, you hear me?" "Yes, Mama." "What if he doesn't eat breakfast either?" Denise paused with the coat halfway off her daughter's arms. "Imani, I'm just asking. I know you are, and the answer is still no. Mr. Hollister is not your responsibility." Imani lowered her head, but not out of obedience alone. It was worry. Denise could already tell the difference. Worry made the child quieter, deeper somehow, as if her small body were trying to carry more feeling than it had room for. Upstairs, Marcus Hollister was already awake. He had taken his medication earlier than usual. He had also, with great effort, gotten himself out of bed and into the armchair by the window. The morning light fell across his lap in a pale, even rectangle. He had not done that in nearly 3 weeks. The act of getting from the bed to the chair without help had cost him so much energy that he had needed to sit motionless for a full 10 minutes before he could trust his breath to behave again. But he had wanted, for reasons he could not yet name with precision, to be sitting upright when the day began. Vivian did not come to his room. That fact on any other morning would have struck him as ordinary. This morning, it struck him as confirmation. She had crossed her own threshold last night. She had walked into the room and found her husband being fed applesauce by a child whose mother she paid to clean the floors. She had treated the moment not as a private grief but as a public inconvenience. She had not come back afterward to apologize. She had not come back this morning to ask how he had slept. She had simply receded further into the part of the house that no longer contained him. Marcus understood, sitting in the armchair with the morning light moving slowly across his blanket, that recede was the wrong word. Vivian had not receded. Vivian had been gone for a long time. He had only just stopped pretending otherwise. He pressed his trembling hand flat against the armrest until the worst of the tremor steadied beneath the pressure of his own palm. Then he reached for the phone on the side table. "Harold," he said when the call connected, "I need to see you, today if possible." The voice on the other end of the line, low and careful and unsurprised, said only, "I can be there by 10. Use the side drive, come through the study door." "Understood." Marcus set the phone back down. By 10:30, Harold Whitmore had arrived. He was a tall man in his early 60s, silver-haired, immaculate even at short notice. He carried a leather folio under one arm and the kind of quiet expression that had served him through nearly 12 years of representing Marcus Hollister's most consequential decisions. Mrs. Albright brought him through the private sitting room entrance without comment. She closed the door behind him and disappeared back down the corridor with the discretion of a woman who had learned long ago not to ask why certain visits happened off the calendar. Harold took one look at Marcus and set the folio down on the side table. "You look terrible. That's friendship talking. That's eyesight." They sat across from each other. The morning light made Marcus's tremor more visible than usual. Harold did not look away from it. He had known Marcus before the diagnosis, before the hollowing, before the long, slow rearrangement of every room in this house around the schedule of a disease. He was perhaps the only person left in Marcus's daily life who still spoke to him the way he had spoken to him before. "Tell me what's happened," Harold said. Marcus drew a slow breath. "I need to begin removing Vivian from things." Harold absorbed the sentence the way he absorbed all important sentences. He did not react. He simply opened the leather folio in his lap. "How much of her? All of her, from the medical authority, from the financial structure, from the trust access, from the future. You are aware that what you are describing is the early framework of a divorce." "Yes," Harold made a note. He did not look up. "You are also aware that once we begin, we cannot pretend afterward that we did not." Marcus looked out the window. The bare branches of the back garden moved gently against the silver sky. "I am aware." Harold lifted his pen from the page. Is there evidence, Marcus? Or is there only the kind of certainty that men in your position sometimes reach when they have run out of patience? Marcus turned his eyes back to him. There is evidence, and I believe there will be more before the week is out. Harold studied him for a long moment. Then, with the small, precise nod of a man who had spent 40 years being told dangerous things in quiet rooms, he turned to a fresh page in the folio and began to write. The days that followed arrived with the strange clarity that often comes to a man who has finally stopped negotiating with his own life. Marcus signed what he could sign when he could sign it. Harold's assistant came and went through the side entrance with a quiet efficiency that drew no attention from the rest of the house. By the third afternoon, the preliminary framework of the divorce had been drafted, the asset structures reviewed, the medical authority paperwork prepared. None of it was final. All of it was beginning. Vivian noticed nothing. That, too, was its own kind of evidence. She came and went from the house with her phone in her hand and her perfume warm at her wrists. Her schedule unusually full for a woman who had spent the past year claiming exhaustion. Twice in 3 days, the security log at the front gate registered a vehicle arriving at the back of the property mid-morning, when Vivian had told Mrs. Albright she would be in the city. Marcus did not need to see the man to know who was inside the car. The name had already arrived, courtesy of Harold, on a single typed page tucked into the leather folio. Daniel Reeves, real estate consultant. A man who had once stood beside Marcus at a hospital fundraiser and shaken his hand with the warm, easy smile of someone who had already begun calculating which parts of another man's life were available to inherit. On the fourth afternoon, Imani came back upstairs. She did not announce herself. She simply appeared in the doorway of the private sitting room, one hand wrapped around the frame, a folded piece of construction paper held carefully in the other. She had been told, every morning that week, to stay in the laundry room. She had stayed, mostly. But the laundry room had a small window that looked out onto the rear garden. From that window, she had been watching the lights in Marcus's upstairs corridor go on and off. She had finally decided, with the steady moral conviction of an 8-year-old, that her mother's rules had run out of reasons. Marcus looked up from the desk. He did not pretend not to be surprised. "How did you get up here? Walking. Does your mother know where you are?" "No," he exhaled through his nose. It was not quite a laugh. "That is not reassuring, Imani." She came farther into the room and held out the folded paper. He took it with his steadier hand. When he unfolded it, he found a crayon drawing of his bedroom. The bed, the window, a small dish with a spoon beside it, a bright round sun smiling from the upper corner of the page. On the bed sat a stick figure with dark hair and one shaky hand. Beside the bed stood a smaller figure with braids and pink sneakers. "It's your room," Imani said, "but I made the morning nicer." His throat tightened in a way he had not expected. "I see that. You didn't have enough yellow in there." He set the drawing carefully on the desk, beside Harold's leather folio, beside the still folded napkin he had not yet been able to put away. Imani watched him with that quiet, serious gaze of hers. "Did you eat lunch?" "A little." "That means no," he almost smiled. "Does your mother know you interrogate people?" "I'm not interrogating, I'm checking." For the next hour she stayed. She did not do anything dramatic. She climbed onto the ottoman near his chair and asked him questions about the model sailboat in the glass case across the room, about the framed photograph of his father on the bookshelf, about whether the sky outside the tall window looked different from up here than it did from the laundry room downstairs. He answered her questions one by one, in a voice that grew steadier as the afternoon wore on. He understood, perhaps for the first time, that what this child was offering him was not pity but company. There was a difference. Pity asked nothing of the person it was extended toward. Company assumed they were still a person worth being with. By the time she left, returned reluctantly to her mother by Mrs. Albright after a soft phone call upstairs, the leather folio on Marcus's desk had quietly become the second most important thing in the room. That evening, Vivian came to dinner alone in the formal dining room. She did not send anyone up to ask whether Marcus would be joining her. He had not expected her to. What he had not expected was the soft chime from the side drive at 12 minutes past 8, or the warm cologne that drifted up the back staircase later when one of the servers passed the corridor outside his door. He reached for the house tablet on the side table beside the chair and woke the screen. He had not used the internal security interface in years. He had installed the system long before the diagnosis. Back when Hollister Industries had still required him to keep an eye on too many properties at once, he had mostly forgotten about its existence. Memory returned quickly when necessity sharpened it. He selected the corridor feed first, then the audio permissions he had once approved for after-hours monitoring. The blue sitting room door appeared on the screen, closed, with a coffee service cart waiting outside it. He pressed play. At first there was only the low hum of the ventilation system and the faint clink of porcelain. Then Vivian's voice softened into a register he had not heard her use with him in over a year. "You took your time. You said after 8. I said use the side drive. There's a difference." A man's quiet, amused laugh, the sound of a cup being set down. Then Vivian, lower now, almost conspiratorial. "He asked about me this morning." "Did he?" "And I told him nothing." The voices continued. Marcus listened to all of it. He did not pause the recording. He did not look away. He let the full shape of the evening unfold in front of him without flinching. When Vivian eventually said, in the cool, practical tone she had once used to plan their anniversary trips, that she was simply waiting for the path of least damage, Marcus closed his eyes for one slow, complete breath. When he opened them, his hand had stopped trembling. Not because the disease had paused. It had not. It would not. But because some clarities arrive heavier than illness. For one long, suspended moment, the weight of the truth was greater than the weight of his own body. He set the tablet face down on the side table. Then he reached for the phone, dialed Harold Whitmore, and said, very quietly, "It's tonight." Vivian came upstairs at 10 minutes past 9. She arrived in the same green silk blouse she had worn to dinner, her perfume still warm at the collar. Her composure intact in the way it was always intact when she believed herself unobserved. She did not knock. She had stopped knocking years ago. "Mrs. Albright said you wanted to see me." Marcus did not look up immediately. He was sitting at the desk now, not the armchair. The leather folio open in front of him. The house tablet face down beside it. Harold's draft documents lay in a neat stack to his left. Imani's folded crayon drawing sat to his right. The small yellow sun smiling up at the lamplight. When he finally raised his eyes, Vivian saw something in his face she had not seen in 2 years. The small, careful muscles around her own face shifted in response before she could stop them. "Sit down," he said. She sat. The chair across from the desk was a low velvet thing he had once chosen because she had said she liked it. She looked smaller in it tonight than he remembered. "I know about Daniel." The sentence landed cleanly between them. Vivian's mouth opened. Then it closed. She had spent years training herself to manage difficult conversations. The training held, but only for a moment. "I don't know what you mean." "Yes, you do. Daniel Reeves is an acquaintance, Marcus. We've had 3 lunches in 5 months, if you've decided that constitutes." "He was in this house tonight." She went very still. He watched the precise moment her composure tried to reassemble itself and failed. "You had someone watching me." "I had truth watching you." It did most of the work on its own. The room was silent for a long time. Vivian looked once at the tablet on the desk, then at the leather folio, then at the small crayon drawing tucked beside it. Marcus saw her gaze pause on the drawing for half a second longer than she would have wanted him to notice. "What exactly do you intend to do, Marcus?" "In the morning, Harold will begin formal proceedings." She did not move. The wineglass she had brought up with her, half full, rested forgotten in her hand. He had expected her to argue. He had expected the careful gloss of indignation, the slow inventory of years given up and sacrifices made. Instead, she said, "You're not strong enough for this." He looked at her. For the first time in their marriage, his face carried no apology. "I am exactly strong enough for this." She left the room without finishing the sentence she had been about to begin. The door closed softly behind her, the way doors close in houses where appearances still matter, even when the marriages inside them no longer do. The next morning, Marcus called Denise and Imani upstairs together. Denise came with the careful, braced expression of a woman who had spent the night being told her daughter could no longer come to the estate. Imani came holding her mother's hand. The yellow sweater traded for a soft cardigan, her braids redone with new ribbons. Harold was already seated at the desk. The papers were already prepared. "Mr. Hollister," Denise said quietly, "if this is about Imani—" "It isn't." She fell silent. Harold slid a single page across the desk toward her. Denise looked down at it, then up at Marcus, then down at it again. Imani, too young to read all of the words but old enough to recognize her own name printed in clear black letters at the top, leaned closer with quiet curiosity. "Why is my name there?" she asked. Marcus looked at her across the desk. His right hand still trembled against the polished wood. His voice did not. "Because in the worst days of my life you did not turn away, and I have decided what kind of heart my life is going to honor." Denise pressed one hand against her mouth. The tears arrived faster than she had time to gather. She read the page once. She read it twice. She looked at Harold for confirmation. Harold gave her the small, professional nod of a man who had spent his career making sure documents like this could not be challenged. "Mr. Hollister," Denise whispered, "that is too much." "No," Marcus said. "It is the first thing in this house that has felt measured correctly in a very long time." Imani crossed the room then. She did not run. She walked with the same quiet seriousness she had brought into this room with applesauce 4 nights before. She stood beside his chair. She reached for the folded napkin that still lay on the desk beside the drawing. She set it gently within his reach, the way she had set it within his reach on that first impossible evening. "I'm glad you're not alone today," she said. Marcus Hollister looked at the child, at her mother weeping quietly behind her, at the signed papers in Harold's hand, at the small crayon son smiling from the drawing on his desk. He understood that justice did not always arrive with spectacle. Sometimes it arrived through a lawyer's pen, a mother's raised child, and a little girl who had once seen a hungry man in a fine room and decided that was reason enough to walk toward him. The Hollister marriage ended in the months that followed, quietly, expensively, and without scandal, because Harold was thorough and Marcus was patient. Vivian moved out before Christmas. Daniel Reeves was never spoken of again in the house. By the time spring arrived, the upstairs corridors had a different quality of light. Denise Ross had been promoted, with a salary that no longer required 2 jobs. Imani had been enrolled in the kind of school that came with libraries longer than her hallway at home. She came to visit Marcus every Saturday afternoon. She read to him sometimes, when his hands were too tired to hold the book. She drew him new drawings. The crayon sun in the corner of the page grew steadier, and so did he, on his better days. The story of Marcus Hollister teaches us something the world is too quick to forget. That true character is revealed not in our comfort, but in our weakness. That wealth and status may attract people in the easy seasons of life, but only genuine kindness stays when dignity begins to fall apart. Betrayal often arrives quietly, dressed in the perfume of someone we trusted. Compassion, when it comes, often arrives in the smallest hands we did not expect to need. If this story touched you, take one moment before you go. Like this video so others can find it. Leave a comment telling us where you are watching from. Subscribe to the channel for more stories that remind us, even in a hard world, that kindness still matters. And remember this: the spoon you lift for someone today may be the smallest thing in their evening, and the largest thing in their entire life.